Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Talking Justice 2016, presented by Bendigo's Loddon Campaspe Community Legal Centre, a program of ARC Justice. I'm Peter Noble, I'm the Executive Officer of ARC Justice, which delivers community legal services all throughout the Loddon Campaspe region, the Goulburn Valley Community Legal Centre, based in Shepparton, and Housing Justice, also based here in Bendigo. We begin by acknowledging that we gather on the land of the Dja Dja Wurrung, whose ancestors and their descendants are the traditional owners of this country. We acknowledge their living culture, unique role in the life of this region, and that they continue to perform age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal. We also acknowledge their elders past and present and welcome members of their community who are with us here tonight. It's now my pleasure to introduce Rodney Carter, CEO of the Dja Dja Wurrung Traditional Owners Group, to provide a welcome to country.
Benjak Muminchika Benjanano Jandak, Larik Dja Dja Wurrung Kundicha. Good evening and I welcome you to our country. My name is Rodney Carter. I'm a descendant of the first peoples of Central Victoria, the Dja Dja Wurrung. And on behalf of our old people, I pay respect to you here today and wish health and happiness to you and yours. I am also here proud of my ancestry. I acknowledge that my ancestors never gave up their struggle to survive. Less than 200 years ago, their life was to begin to change forever by this imposed modern world. But today I stand before you because of values that we should all hold dear as a community, to be able to be tolerant, to respect each other's individuality and diversity. The compassion shown by some to my ancestors potentially gave them a window of opportunity to survive. And it was those ancestors that then used that opportunity to ensure that they had a productive life. These are the values of the Dja Dja Wurrung holds dear. And we will teach our children and their children of the importance of these values. I and other Dja Dja Wurrung are not under any illusion of the small number we are as a people. We are a minority in our own lands. Our Dja Dja Wurrung family has survived, and all the while many peoples that have come to our land have been viewed indifferently, and all the while through disease, being hunted, being poisoned, exclusion from country and our resources, which all had terrible effects upon us as a family, we still cared and shared amongst you. This is what the Dja Dja Wurrung believe is family, and through all life's challenges we must support each other. Today the Dja Dja Wurrung are actively contributing to the whole community, and we hope all Victorians positively recognise each other's unique individuality that contributes to strong, lasting, healthy and vibrant communities. And for us, we view the idea of justice delayed as justice denied. And for my people over the last 200 years, we've held out and waited for some sort of hope through a justice system, through law. And for us in recent times, over the last 13 years, that was thought to be native title. And for us as a people, native title was a journey where we lost a lot of our old people along the way and was very painful to us. The Victorian government, realising the pain that our people were experiencing, implemented some very visionary legislation, the Traditional Owner Settlement Act. It gave us an opportunity as people today to use the strength that our ancestors had about seizing upon an opportunity. So for the Dja Dja Wurrung people that have entered into the Recognition Settlement Agreement with the State of Victoria, it's seen as an opportunity where we put aside our aspirations for native title, for land justice, for compensation, and hopefully provides an opportunity for future generations where we can be respected as an equal, as a part of the Victorian community. I wish you all Dalkup Murupuk, good spirit and a safe journey always across my country. Waminjika, welcome to Dja Dja Wurrung country. Thank you.
Thanks, Rodney, for that really warm and thoughtful welcome to country tonight. Now in its third year, Talking Justice provides an opportunity for people in regional Victoria to reflect on the big justice issues: refugee policy, crime and punishment, gender equality, sexual diversity, dispossession, reconciliation and global poverty. Harvard professor and moral philosopher Michael Sandel, in his book Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, says that to achieve a just society, we have to reason together about the meaning of the good life and to create a public culture hospitable to the disagreements that will inevitably arise. Here, right now, we're seeking to build a hospitable public culture. And so we invite you to engage with this evening's presenters in that spirit, mindful of the views that you have and committed to our collective well-being. Please honour the opportunity to listen to the speakers, honour our invitation to them and their willingness to come, and honour the limited time that we have together. We'd like to thank our speakers, and particularly our facilitator Martin Krigier, who will guide our discussions. We'd also like to thank our platinum sponsors, the Victoria Law Foundation, the City of Greater Bendigo, especially staff and volunteers at the Alhambra and Capitol Theatres here tonight, Arnold Dallas McPherson Lawyers, Coburg Community Health, the Reichstein Foundation, Haven Home Safe, Jimmy Possum and Bress. Without our sponsors, this Law Week event could not have happened. It also couldn't have happened without our events reference group or our hardworking staff and volunteers, especially Nicole Smith and Steve Wormersley, who've gone beyond the call to deliver this quality event. It's now my great pleasure to introduce Martin Krigier. Martin is the Gordon Samuels Professor of Law and Social Theory, Co-Director, Network for Interdisciplinary Studies of Law at the University of New South Wales. He is a deep thinker, a wonderful conversationalist, and we're lucky to be in his hands tonight. Please join me in welcoming him.
I'm going to go this way. There was one.
Hello, I'm Martin Krigier. I'm called MC, which I think is short for Master of this Circus, and I'll be mastering this circus for the next day and a half. We complain, many of us do, rightly so, about the quality of parliamentary debate today. But a lot of our public debates aren't so hot either. Slanging off, preaching to the converted, demonising people we disagree with, refusing to budge from entrenched positions. This is autobiography I'm giving you, but it's true of many of us. Of course, those two discussions, the parliamentary and the public discussion, aren't unrelated. They feed off each other and sometimes they escalate, exacerbate each other. There should be better ways. And in our history, there have been better ways. And it's all the more disappointing these days. Many of you will know of the, maybe apocryphal, but anyway, often repeated Chinese curse, which has become a cliche, may you live in interesting times. Well, unfortunately, we now do live, globally, we live in interesting times. In some ways, more interesting than at any time, it seems to me, since the period before the Second World War, and for some similar reasons, but I hope not with the same consequences. One of the things that makes our time interesting is that we're faced with multiple and simultaneous wicked problems. That's a recent coinage, it's a term of art. Some of those problems are wicked in the ordinary sense of the word. They involve evil, bad doing. But the term has come to mean something different. And according to Wikipedia, which is my Bible on all things, a wicked problem is a problem that's difficult or impossible to solve because of incomplete, contradictory, and changing requirements that are often difficult to recognise. And among our wicked problems are the enormous and growing number of refugees worldwide and the sources of their fleeing and becoming refugees, uncertain economic present and future in much of the world and maybe globally, climate change, indigenous development, growing inequalities in developed and developing countries, rising nationalist, exclusivist trends in Europe and beyond, murderous conflicts in the Middle East and elsewhere, people trafficking, and I'm just getting warm, and I haven't even mentioned the word Donald. So these wicked problems are not just technically difficult, that is, it's hard to know what to do about them, they're morally fraught. They raise huge and complex issues of fairness, of justice, and of respect. And that's why it's all the more important today, not just to settle in our fixed positions, however committed to them we are, and to listen to those we agree with, however persuasive we find them, and to boo those we don't agree with because we know they're demons. It's important that we engage in discussions that rise to the complexity and the difficulty of the problems we face. That means they've got to rise very high. And many of them have to do with justice, and so it's particularly appropriate to have this sort of gathering sponsored by this sort of organisation. It's the third of such gatherings which Peter Noble and his team in the Community Legal Centre here have organised. And when Peter started it off 2 years ago, it's gone from strength to strength. Each time I come, the room gets bigger, not because I'm putting on weight, or not simply because of that. I remember Peter asking me to participate in the first one, and I said, sure, but I had no idea what he wanted me to do, I had no idea what he wanted to do, still less what he wanted me to do. And I'm not sure I was alone in that. I don't think he had a clue either, but he had an instinct. And it's been a good instinct, and I've said why I think this is important. I think it's important, but fortunately it'll also, I'm confident, be enjoyable, because the people that have been assembled for this gathering, the people who you will be listening to and talking with and asking questions of, are distinguished thinkers, distinguished writers, some distinguished singers, and distinguished doers. And 3 of them are here tonight, and I will start. The 3 will speak consecutively from my right towards me. And so we start with the sublimely named Paris Aristotle. Paris is the director of Foundation House, the Victorian Foundation for Survivors of Torture. He's been on various government advisory boards for refugee settlement. He was particularly prominent, or became particularly well known, when he was appointed in 2012 to the Prime Minister's expert panel on asylum seekers, and I imagine that about this and many other things we'll be hearing from him now. He has so many distinctions, as everybody here, apart from the guy who's talking, have, that I won't continue with them except to mention one last distinction which is close to my heart, and one that he shares with Julian, with Peter, and I think with Julian McMahon, who will be speaking tomorrow. Once a year, I enjoy giving a 2-day course on justice and society for the Cranrana program in Melbourne, together with the Melbourne barrister David Neal, who chaired last year's event here. You would have met him then. Paris, Julian, Peter, and John are all alumni in good standing of that course, and I'm delighted to see them tonight. I like to think that I taught them all they know, and that might not be true, and even if it is true, it might be nothing to be proud of, and that's something that you'll have to determine in the next hour or so, and I ask Paris to begin persuading you that it is true.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Martin, and Peter, for the invitation to talk to everybody here tonight. You may think, after listening to me, that Martin and I have spoken before this talk, but I promise you we only caught up about an hour ago, well after I wrote this. But my 20 minutes starts now. That wasn't counted. I've been asked to speak about the themes of justice, liberty and fairness in relation to refugee issues internationally, regionally and domestically. The allotted time of 20 minutes might be a bit tight to do that thoroughly, so I propose to make some observations about a few of many possible issues of concern at a global level and with respect to Australia and its relationship with our region. The global scale of injustice is staggering and mind-numbing. Let me quote from a recent document, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. It said, "Record numbers of people have been forced to flee their homes and are displaced within and across borders as a result of persecution, violent conflict, extremism, human rights violations, disasters, as well as now emerging megatrends such as climate change. An increasing percentage of displaced people are also caught in protracted refugee and international displacement situations with their exile lasting sometimes for several decades in the absence of solutions." As of the end of 2014, and these numbers are important to contextualise things, as at the end of 2014, the number of people forcibly displaced as a result of conflict and persecution was nearly 60 million, including 13.9 million newly displaced in that year. It had been 37.5 million a decade before. Among them are 19.5 million refugees. 45% of the refugees, almost 9 million people, were in what UNHCR calls a protracted situation, defined as one in which 25,000 or more refugees of the same nationality have been in exile for 5 years or more in a given asylum country. There were 33 such protracted refugee situations. In 1994, the average duration of one of those protracted situations was 9 years. At present, the average duration has grown to about 20 years. A recent UN report stated that in some protracted situations, refugee situations, a third generation of children are born into displacement. In the opinion of the UNHCR, the Syria situation was poised to become the largest protracted refugee and displacement crisis of the decade. The UNHCR estimates that there are over 12 million Syrian people of concern to the agency. Of these, 7.5 million are internally displaced, trapped within the borders, and 4.8 million are refugees and asylum seekers. There's been pressure to increase the number of resettlement places in the light of the conflict in Syria beyond the 100,000 places on offer each year at present. However, even if the international community quintupled that figure immediately to 500,000 places and not one more person became a refugee, it would still take 39 years to settle them all. So while it is vital to increase global resettlement places, it is clearly not the answer on its own. A few months ago, the head of Human Rights Watch, Ken Roth, wrote an opinion piece urging people not to call the flow of Syrian refugees to Europe a crisis, on the grounds that the numbers of people involved was a very small proportion of the region's population. His plea was in vain, as we know that this is the perspective of a significant number of European governments and has caused very profound rifts between them. Importantly, many experts in this field are increasingly concerned about the extent to which the crisis in Syria and the subsequent implications for Europe is absorbing the vast bulk of international attention at the expense of other large-scale crises in Africa and elsewhere. The Dadaab refugee camp with 300,000 refugees is one case in point. So we can see from a global perspective the nature, complexity and extent of injustices are profound. But what about the Australian perspective on the other side of the ledger? Let me begin with some positives. Australia continues to have one of the largest refugee resettlement programs in the world, and further expansion is scheduled from the current quota of 13,750 to 18,750 on an annual basis in 2018-19. On top of that, the government announced an additional one-off 12,000 places of people fleeing the conflict in Syria and Iraq. There's considerable public support for resettlement of refugees. In comparative terms, our resettlement program is both substantial numerically and very well funded for the provision of key services. In fact, the former UNHCR High Commissioner, Mr. Antonio Guterres, praised Australia for having what he felt was the best settlement services in the world. There's been some controversy this week over comments made about the difficulties of resettling refugees who were illiterate or innumerate and what that meant for the cost to taxpayers. I don't want to give those comments too much oxygen, given that they're made in the context of an election campaign with all of the baggage and loaded intent that such a context brings. The first point to make, though, is that we invite refugees to resettle and become members of the Australian community. They are therefore not taking jobs away from Australians. They are Australians. The issue of successful settlement and employment outcomes is a valid one for governments to consider. However, the simple truth is that we have had one of the most successful resettlement programs for over 60 years. We've resettled more than 800,000 people from a diverse range of countries and socio-economic backgrounds. We've done it extremely well, and many have gone on to be successful in business and in community life. I also have absolute confidence that we can, as a country, resettle many more refugees while also improving their employment and settlement outcomes at the same time. On the negative side, the injustices is the treatment of asylum seekers who came without valid visas. That is so in the case of both those whose claims for protection are being processed in Australia and those transferred to Nauru and Papua New Guinea. As Martin said, I was a member of the so-called expert panel who in 2012 was asked by Prime Minister Gillard to provide advice on how best to prevent asylum seekers risking their lives by travelling to Australia by boat. The terms of reference for the panel were: the panel will provide advice and recommendations to the government on policies available and the efficacy of such options to prevent asylum seekers risking their lives on dangerous boat journeys to Australia. I was of course aware of the considerable scepticism about the government's motives for establishing the panel. But in spite of that scepticism, I accepted the invitation because I had come to the position that from a moral perspective, the increasing rate of deaths at sea had reached a point and was on a trajectory that I could personally no longer accept. In approaching this issue, I held the firm belief, and still do today, that people smuggling has flourished not because asylum seekers have a preference to engage them, but because the international community is yet to develop a system that would make what smugglers offer unnecessary and therefore irrelevant. A system that would stabilise populations, properly care for them and process them in a timely manner. In that context, the growing phenomenon of people smuggling and increasing death toll from such ventures are as a consequence of both the criminal actions of smugglers and the hopeless inaction of governments. The strategies of governments and oppositions have for years been dominated by a desire to generate electoral capital by presenting themselves as unwaveringly tough on border protection. This emphasis holds precedence over responding to the protection needs of asylum seekers, and therefore compounds their situation and diverts the suffering elsewhere. A failure to appreciate that the people at the centre of global human displacement need, deserve and ultimately will seek out the safety they crave makes for bad policy. Importantly, policy proposed by understandably and appropriately concerned advocates, such as myself and others, academics and community members, that fail to fully appreciate the dangers that people smuggling generates and the regional and domestic politics of the issue are also badly flawed. Policies with such shortcomings will also inevitably lead to higher death tolls and diminish public confidence in how we manage these issues. The debate and policy thinking has become a binary argument, predicated on the false assumption that there is an inextricable link between harsh deterrence measures and as the means to preventing people smuggling. But this is simply untrue. Treating people seeking asylum humanely and preventing people smuggling are not mutually exclusive exercises. They are in fact complementary and should go hand in hand. Such dilemmas are what policymakers refer to, this is where you'll think Martin and I were talking, as wicked problems. They're characterised by a high resistance to resolution. There's often disagreement about the causes of the problems and the best way to tackle them. Attempts to address wicked problems often lead to unforeseen consequences. Wicked problems usually have no clear solution, may never be completely solved, and the challenge is to find the best way to manage them instead. And wicked problems are also socially complex. They involve coordinated action by a range of governmental and civil society stakeholders. So these characteristics and the wider global picture outlined earlier, given these characteristics and that picture, how do I believe concepts of justice and fairness could be incorporated into policy formulation? Firstly, practicality and fairness should take precedence over theory and inertia, and no single focus can provide an effective basis for policy making. This is true whether the focus is on better protections for asylum seekers or on disincentives to discourage them from taking dangerous maritime voyages. Strategies need to shift the balance of Australian policies and regional arrangements to give greater hope and confidence to asylum seekers that regional arrangements will work more effectively, and rather than denying asylum seekers the right to take those terrible risks, there is a responsibility to create opportunities that would enable their claims to be processed more fairly and effectively and in ways that make those risks unnecessary. That was the centrepiece argument of the panel in making the case for a regional set of arrangements that would provide the best basis for managing these issues. In spite of our pleading, the inability of the Parliament to agree on the implementation of the entire package as an integrated whole saw a reversion by that government and others since to punitive deterrence strategies that have pulled us to the position we now find ourselves in. Measures such as arbitrary detention, harsh living conditions and lengthy delays in processing and resettlement, for example, are not effective or necessary components in tackling people smuggling. People smugglers don't care about such measures anyway, and the conditions many people are fleeing are far worse. The only guaranteed outcome from such approaches is that they inevitably cause severe psychological harm with tragic consequences. The self-immolations on Nauru recently and the at least 7 suicides of asylum seekers in Australia between 2014 and 2015 are proof of that. The government can rightly claim that it has stopped people smuggling ventures to Australia from succeeding and, more importantly, preventing further deaths at sea. This is a good thing and important to acknowledge, but should not be achieved at any cost. A guarantee that responses will treat all people humanely and decently is just as important. Now we're in strife. From my point of view, in spite of the claimed success to date, it remains to be seen how sustainable the current arrangements are, particularly as there has been no effective progress towards a workable regional system and no decent resettlement for those found to be refugees on Manus Island and Nauru, or for those awaiting processing in Australia. A strategy characterised by justice and fairness would necessitate these two elements, and if they are absent, which is currently the case, then sustainability will become very uncertain. So what could have the outcomes been had the integrated package been allowed to be implemented? Firstly, it would have ensured that any policy initiative needed to accord with our international human rights obligations, with mechanisms built in to monitor compliance with that principle. Our humanitarian program would have reached approximately 25,000 places per annum by now, with a trajectory towards 27 over the next 2 years. It would have added an additional 4,000 family reunion places per annum for asylum seekers and refugees to the family migration program. This would have brought the annual total of humanitarian visas to 31,000 and would have reduced the waiting time for family reunion from 22 years to 2 years. For those processed in any regional arrangements, be that in Nauru, PNG, Malaysia or eventually Indonesia, the central safeguards such as no arbitrary detention, decent and appropriate accommodation, educational and vocational training, employment opportunities, legal representation, merits review, health and mental health care, and genuine resettlement pathways would have been a prerequisite. In spite of our pleading, the inability of the Parliament to agree on the implementation of the entire package as an integrated whole saw a reversion by that government. Oops, sorry, I've gone wrong page. Such arrangements would have enabled refugees to see a future for themselves and their families. They could have spent their time investing in ways that would have strengthened their ability to resettle as those opportunities became available. The proposed package would have ensured their eligibility for resettlement to Australia or other countries such as the US and New Zealand, and based on early work to improve regional systems, resettlement out of those places would have begun in late 2014 or early 2015. Of greatest importance is that we would have been 3.5 years into the development of a regional protection framework that could have stabilised populations in the hundreds of thousands, if not millions, cared for them and processed them, and found one of several durable solutions. It would have been a system, for example, that could have immediately responded to the plight of 8,000 Rohingya adrift and dying in the Andaman Sea in 2015, as opposed to allowing many to perish before action was begrudgingly taken to rescue them. The only disincentive would have been that if a person chose to bypass the regional system, they would have been transferred back into it, cared for, processed and provided with a durable solution in a more timely and equitable fashion, along with other people in that process. There'd have been no case to support temporary protection visas, to ban family reunion, or to eliminate legal assistance for people lodging their claims in Australia. Perhaps the worst decision that was made subsequent to Prime Minister Gillard being removed from office was when Prime Minister Rudd took the position further by announcing that nobody who had sought to arrive in Australia by boat would ever be allowed to resettle here. A position quickly embraced by the Abbott government, opposition and then government. The denial of resettlement in Australia from those countries is now a bedrock policy of Coalition and Labor. In my view, this is also now the principal cause of psychological harm, extreme hopelessness and devastating desperation. I don't make these points as a defence of or argument for resurrecting the panel report along with its recommendations. It's virtually 4 years on now and there have been substantial shifts in global trends. I make these points to highlight that if we are to turn back from where we are now, we can't simply turn back to where we had come from. A new attempt at building a decent regional set of arrangements is required, but make no mistake, it will require an integrated package of a similar nature to that proposed by the panel. In this area of public policy, we would be very naive to think that what is on offer is a choice between the good and the bad, either explicitly or implicitly, by design or necessary consequence. All the policy packages which have been seriously proposed have harsh aspects, almost always more than is necessary, much more severe than is required or acceptable and guaranteed to cause harm. As a consequence, they struggle to withstand rigorous scrutiny as to their feasibility domestically or internationally or both. I think the scope for proper detailed discussion of the issues within Australia has been unduly constrained. Too often people of different views hurl assertions and insults rather than patiently listening to each other in respectful dialogue. I'm not suggesting that such dialogue will produce consensus, nor should it aim to do so. Of course, people will continue to have legitimate differences of view about competing ethical considerations, as well as judgments about the likely consequences of any course of action. But the quality of political decision-making can only improve if participants allow for the possibility that those with whom they disagree are not necessarily evil bastards or simpletons, but may be making points that warrant attention. In concluding, the question that confronts us all is how many people must continue to subsist and suffer for years in perpetual fear of their lives around the world, in our region and in our country, and how many must die from perilous journeys before all parties in this debate come together and identify fair, credible and just compromises that do not erode the edifice of our humanitarian responsibilities or allow the perfect to become the enemy of the good. Thank you.
In case you think that the MC here is particularly ineffectual, the bell ringing is a warning that there is time to go on. It wasn't that Paris was denying my demands. My university had a foundation dean who's now 93. His name is Hal Wooten. And he's a great man, I think. And in his honour, the later dean created a Hal Wooten lecture. And each year, a distinguished lecturer is invited. In consultation with Hal, who always begins by saying that he's 93, but he's still got marbles, he says, I'm very glad that this eponymous lecture in his name, is not the memorial Hal Wooten lecture, but he's given a lot of thought to who he'd like to invite to speak, and he's much taken with a sentence of the great American judge and jurist Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote that a person may live greatly in the law as well as elsewhere, and Hal keeps looking for examples, not so easy to find, of people who have lived greatly in the law. This is not a sermon I'm giving you because I want to introduce such a person who was last year's Hal Wooten lecture, and Julian Burnside, as you know, is a barrister who has become prominent in public debate on issues particularly to do with refugees. But that's not where he began, as being one of Australia's most successful barristers who's dealt with particularly commercial litigation for, as he's put it, the big end of town. But from the late 90s onwards, Burnside began to undertake more and more pro bono legal work on a range of human rights-related issues. He acted for Victoria's chief civil liberties organisation in the action against the Australian government over the Tampa affair. He, with his wife, artist Kate Durham, he set up spare rooms for refugees and spare lawyers for refugees programs, which provide free accommodation and legal representation for refugees in Australia. He's been enormously active, enormously effective in speaking and acting for people in terrible plight, and for that he's won a list longer than I'm going to tax your patience with of well-merited honours. He was, in 2009, made an Officer of the Order of Australia for service as a human rights advocate, particularly for refugees and asylum seekers. He also has written on philology. So that suggests, I think, that he speaks very well, and he speaks about important subjects, and he's about to show these talents to you now.
Thank you very much. I should say at the start, at the risk of this becoming a sort of mutual admiration society, the Cranlana program is spectacular, and Martin's teaching of that program when I attended it really did reshape the way I thought about things. As a matter of chance, I did the Cranlana Justice in Society program just a couple of months after doing the Tampa litigation. And that turned out to be pretty important because the Tampa litigation in 2001 first alerted me to what we were doing to refugees. And as a matter of interest, the judgment in the Tampa case was handed down by Justice North at 2:15 in the afternoon Melbourne time on the 11th of September 2001. 10 hours later there was the attack on America, and that profoundly changed attitudes in Australia, not just attitudes to boat people, but also attitudes to Muslims. And it's been one of the most damaging influences in Australian society, but I'll probably come back to that a bit later. Being something of a literalist, I have taken a fairly literal approach to the topic, thinking first about justice and then about global dislocation. Now, justice is interesting, and of course lawyers love to think about justice, but I wonder how many of us actually understand what justice is. I suspect very few people have got a really clear idea of what constitutes justice. And there's a simple way of testing it, a thought experiment. Imagine it's the last day of the school holidays. Mum's at the end of her tether because the kids have been ratty. She's in the kitchen. I mean, this so far it's pretty realistic. She's in the kitchen cooking dinner, and there's a crash in the living room, and she rushes in. The kids have disappeared, but her best, most precious vase, handed down from generation to generation, is smashed to bits on the hearth. Now here we go in two different directions. First, she just knows it's the young boy who did it. She finds him, punishes him, sends him to bed without dinner. As it happens, he did do it. Alternative, because she understands the processes of justice, she goes and finds each of the children in turn, asks them neutral questions, puts it all together carefully and dispassionately, comes to the conclusion it was the young boy who did it. She finds him, punishes him, sends him to bed without dinner. As it happens, he didn't do it. Now, which of those two scenarios is closer to your conception of justice? Most lawyers cannot answer that, at least without hesitation. And ultimately, most of them come down in saying that the second one is closer to their idea of justice, and that's the one I think I'd vote for, because the good process is more likely to result in an outcome which is correct. But it sharply points out the distinction between justice and fairness, because viewed from society's position, the second scenario is closer to justice. Viewed from the boy's position, it looks terribly unfair. Now, so there we have the problem. We actually don't quite know what justice is, although we might know the process which is most calculated to reach a just decision in most circumstances. Then what about global dislocation? What has that got to do with justice? On one view, it's entirely irrelevant. It doesn't change what justice is. It might change the circumstance in which justice needs to be established, and especially global dislocation will be and is important in the way individual human beings live their lives. So for them, global dislocation and justice are pretty closely tied up, although they may not have any ways of achieving a just outcome. It's highly relevant to refugees because they're the ones for whom global dislocation probably means the worst outcomes. Now, it's important, especially in light of what Paris said, it's important to bear in mind that in Australia we have three streams of refugees who come into the country. The first is the offshore resettlement program that he spoke about. And he's right, we are one of the most generous countries in the world. Not every country has an offshore resettlement program. We choose to go out and select refugees from refugee camps and we bring them in, and of course we impose a quota, and it's 13,750 people a year. But the second stream of refugees who come to Australia are people who are lucky enough to be able to get a passport from their country of origin and a visa to come to Australia, and they come here by aeroplane, typically on a business visa, a tourist visa, student visa, something of that sort. And when they have cleared passport control, then they apply for a protection visa. Now, those people, interestingly, are left in the community. Once their initial visa runs out, they're left in the community and they get by and no one really bothers about them and no one is troubled by them. We don't get bilious headlines from Andrew Bolt or anyone else complaining about them. Ultimately, on the figures over the last 15 or 20 years, roughly 30 or 40% of them are ultimately accepted as refugees. So the people who come here by aeroplane and ask for protection turn out mostly not to be refugees, but we're not troubled by that. The third stream are the boat people. Now they come by boat, notwithstanding that it's more expensive than an aeroplane, they come by boat because they can't get a visa to come to Australia. Because if you, for example, if you're a Hazara from Afghanistan and you apply for a tourist visa to come to Australia, you'll be refused it, because it's a pretty fair bet that you'll ask for protection once you've got into the country. So they can't get visas to come here. So if they come from the trouble spots and they look as though they probably will be refugees, they will not get a visa to come to Australia. Now, those of you who've travelled outside the country, you know when you get on the aeroplane to come back into Australia, the airline is really careful about your paperwork, much more than when you're travelling across Europe, more than when you're going to another country. When you come into Australia, the airline's very fussy about your paperwork, because our government says if you, the airline, bring people into this country who do not have a right to enter the country, you can take them back at your expense. That's why the airlines are so careful about it. So these people can't get an airline ticket because they can't get a visa, which means they will not be allowed onto a plane. And so the only way to escape persecution is to use people smugglers. And that's all very well and good until they get down to Indonesia or Malaysia, but Indonesia and Malaysia haven't signed the Refugees Convention and don't protect them. And so the last step for them is very dangerous. It involves getting on a boat and being taken across to Christmas Island. Those are the boat people. The boat people is the third stream of refugees who come into Australia. On the figures in the last 15 years, about 94% of them are ultimately assessed as genuine refugees. So get this for a little bit of irony. We're completely untroubled by the ones who are probably not refugees, but we want to brutalise and mistreat the ones who are almost certainly refugees. There's a curiosity. I've never understood that one. The problem, when you take these figures overall, Australia ranks number 67 in the countries of the world for resettlement of refugees. We may be one of the most generous when it comes to the offshore resettlement program, but overall our acceptance of refugees puts us at the 67th position. It's very important because politicians often brag about us being the most generous country in relation to refugees. It is untrue. But then we're accustomed to politicians lying to us, and I will come back to that too. The problem that for justice for people dislocated in the age of global dislocation is that we are selfish enough to say, we won't let you in, it's our country, you can all just go away. In fact, it was captured perfectly, and I hope there aren't any children present, it was captured perfectly. You may have seen a T-shirt that did the rounds a few years ago. It was a map of Australia and an asylum seeker boat, and the caption said, piss off, we're full. And someone had crossed out full and written in, worried about you drowning. And that kind of captures it pretty well. The present government, when in opposition, used to celebrate every asylum seeker boat that sank, every drowning at sea was celebrated by them because it meant they had another stick to beat the government with. Every drowning of anyone, of course, is tragic, but never forget, when people are running for their lives, it's dangerous. All of history tells us that refugees perish, some refugees perish, in their attempt to reach safety. And it doesn't matter whether they're coming to Australia and they perish in the Indian Ocean, or whether they're going across to Europe and perish in the Mediterranean, or they're going through Europe and perish in the back of an unventilated truck, or if all those things are too dangerous and they stand their ground and face the Taliban and they're killed, well, they're still dead, just as if they'd drowned. And I really do not believe any politician is sincere when they say we must stop the drownings, because you're not actually stopping the drownings, you're just stopping us from knowing about the drownings. When those same people get killed somewhere else, we don't know about it, our conscience is clear. That's one of the realities of justice in the age of global dislocation. Now, what we have done, we've really cranked things up since Paris and the panel did their work and the government cherry-picked the bits of the recommendations that they thought they might implement without the inconvenience of the balancing items. Since then, we have brought offshore processing to a level of harshness that is almost inconceivable. We now, if people arrive in Australia seeking protection, they are taken by force to Manus Island if they're unaccompanied men, or to Nauru if they are women or children or family groups. Nauru, you may be aware, is an island republic with an area of 21 square kilometres. Nauru is smaller than Tullamarine Airport. It does not have enough water for its own people. It does not have enough food for its own people. It has no noticeable GDP apart from what we pay them to warehouse refugees for us. People sent to offshore detention experience extraordinarily harsh conditions. You may recall that in February 2014, during a disturbance in the Manus detention centre, one man was killed, Reza Barati. He was murdered by someone who was on the Australian payroll. And Scott Morrison said, who was Immigration Minister at the time, said that Reza Barati had escaped from the camp and was killed outside the camp by locals. That was also false, but then we're accustomed to falsehoods coming from Scott Morrison because, and I'm sorry for being undiplomatic, Paris, Scott Morrison is a liar and Peter Dutton is a liar, and the lie they tell most repeatedly and most toxically is that these people are illegal. It is untrue, and they know it's untrue. Unfortunately, it is a lie which works politically, and it's worked politically because of the accident of timing that I mentioned earlier, that the Tampa judgment was handed down just hours before the attack on America. And after the attack on America on 9/11, there were no longer any terrorists, only Muslim terrorists. There were no longer boat people, only Muslim boat people. And John Howard started calling them illegal, and it has stuck. And the Liberals have continued to call them illegal falsely in order to make all of you worry about them and be scared of them because, God, they're Muslims and they're criminals. What a fright. What a terrible thing. That's one of the worst things for justice in the age of global dislocation, is that people like us in rich, marvellous countries like Australia, we are prepared to mistreat people so that they will never get a chance of sharing what we have and helping contribute to it, and they won't get that chance because we've demonised them by the lies of our politicians. Those people really deserve a lot better. When Scott Morrison became he's going to become Prime Minister when the next election happens, so think about that. I'll put $20 on that one. No, think about it. Turnbull will get back, but he'll get back with a reduced majority. The party room, which is very strong right wing, will roll him and he will be replaced by Scott Morrison PM. It's a horrible thought, but sorry to spoil your night. I'm only spoiling your night. He'll spoil your future. When Scott Morrison became Immigration Minister, he renamed the Department of Immigration and Citizenship the Department of Immigration and Border Protection, so that the public who don't need to think about these things too deeply now think we're being protected from criminals. Well, you know, if it gets a bit rough, well, you know, you can't make omelettes without breaking eggs. And that, I'm afraid, is the way we've got. So, Reza Barati, killed. Killed inside the detention centre on Manus by someone on the Australian payroll. He was attacked by a bloke who had a long plank of timber with 2 long nails through the far end. He was clobbered to the ground, fell to the ground with blood streaming from his scalp, and he was then surrounded by 12 guards paid by us, who then took turns to kick him in the head and in the torso, and then another person on the Australian payroll picked up a large rock and brought it crashing down on his head, and that killed him. Then, as you would have seen recently in the Four Corners program, Hamid Karzai, who cut his foot on Manus Island, developed sepsis. And because of criminal neglect in the Department of Immigration in Canberra, he died of sepsis whilst he was evacuated far too late to Brisbane for treatment. Scott Morrison said that he was in a Brisbane hospital getting the best medical treatment available. The only problem is he was brain dead, and Morrison forgot to mention that. He was brain dead because he had been neglected so badly and not evacuated when the doctor said he should be. And recently, of course, you saw the self-immolation of Omid Masoumeh and of Hodan Yassin. Omid, whose name means hope, committed suicide, even though he'd been accepted as a refugee. He was so desperate about what the future held, he killed himself by setting himself on fire. And Kathy Wilcox, who I will always cherish as a great cartoonist, did a cartoon of him, just a simple cartoon of a man engulfed in flames, and the caption said, "Not drowning." I was speaking to a friend who's just come back from Nauru. The Supreme Court of Nauru just today decided in a refugee case that it does not have the power to decide a constitutional question of whether the detention of refugees is beyond constitutional power. Now, that's a curious thing because the Supreme Court is the ultimate court in Nauru, and it has just said today it doesn't have power to interpret its own constitution. It's profoundly odd. The Papua New Guinea Supreme Court decided just a few weeks ago that the detention system that we set up with them and which we pay for to this day is unconstitutional. Bear this in mind. In the age of global dislocation, Australia's human rights standards fall below those standards which Papua New Guinea has and which their Supreme Court is prepared to enforce. Dutton, as I mentioned before, continues to call people illegal. He also says that they're illiterate and innumerate in their own language. I don't know how anyone can be innumerate in a language of any sort, except maths. But even worse, he said that these things which happen, Hamid Karzai and Omid committing suicide and Reza Barati being murdered, and 48 other suicides, by the way, in immigration detention, these are an unfortunate aspect, but they are part of the deterrent. Part of the deterrent. In other words, if people are sufficiently brutalised, they will prefer to stay at home and face down the Taliban than come to Australia and be treated like that. Well, there's another form of deterrent which would have the same outcome. We could just take a few refugees out and execute them in public. They would be morally equivalent and would certainly be a deterrent. I wonder if there's any Australian who would go along with that. I hope not, and I suspect not. But we've been misled by politicians who persuaded us that these moral outrages are somehow justifiable because, after all, we wouldn't want people sharing our good fortune and contributing to it. Some of the richest people in Australia came here as refugees, and they have built great fortunes and they have built great companies to the great benefit of Australia. Now, some people say, oh, that's all very well. And by the way, the wicked problem, it's partly wicked. It's only wicked because the parliamentarians have lied to us by calling these people illegal, so that the public want us to lock them up and mistreat them in the mistaken belief that we're being protected from criminals. There is an alternative. And there's a number of alternatives, but one that occurs to me and you might like to think about is this. Let us shut down offshore processing. No exception, just shut it down. Let's accept that people who come to Australia, people who are brave enough to risk their lives trying to come to Australia to seek safety, will very likely be refugees, and they will start coming again as long as the brutalising stops. I accept that that's just a human reality. And okay, detain them initially, just in case some have communicable diseases or whatever else. Lock them up, but hold that detention to 1 month maximum, and use that for preliminary health and security checks. At the end of 1 month, release them into the community on a visa which requires them to stay in touch with the public, with the immigration department, and which allows them to work, basic to human dignity, and which allows them full access to Medicare and Centrelink benefits, equally important to human dignity in this country. And finally, until their refugee status is decided, they must live in a specified rural town or city. Now, let's make some assumptions. The highest ever arrival rate of uninvited boat people was 25,000 people. We'll leave aside 1788, but in 2012, the highest number was around about 25,000. Let's assume that becomes the new normal. And let's pretend that in the Dutton fantasy world, they all remain on full Centrelink benefits for the whole time. What does that cost the economy? $500 million a year. Of course, all of that would be spent in the economies of rural towns and cities, which would be good for them. And it is less than we are spending brutalising them. We are spending between $2,000 and $5,000 million a year brutalising asylum seekers and providing wealth for companies like Wilson Security of Manus, Nauru and Panama. We can do better, and we can do it more cheaply than we're doing it now, and we can benefit rural Australia, and we can benefit asylum seekers who want nothing more than to contribute to a country which is prepared to treat them decently and give them a chance. That, in an age of global dislocation, is one way that we might like to achieve justice. Thank you.
Gerry with a hard Q.
Our third speaker, Felicity Gerry QC, is coming at the same generic problem, global dislocation, from a somewhat different vantage point. Felicity, I don't know, I'm sure you're unique in many ways, but are you unique in being a practicing member of the London Bar and a practicing member of the Darwin Bar?
Yeah.
10 weeks, as I understand it, in London every year, and the rest of the time practicing in Darwin. She's been recognised in Legal 500 as a fearless and effective advocate, tenacious in court, and by other experts as a vastly experienced advocate noted for her experience in serious sexual cases, homicides and frauds. She's prosecuted and defended numerous cases involving minor, serious, complex crime, often with an international element, and she was, for those of you who religiously watch Foreign Correspondent, fascinatingly portrayed. I mean, she was not portrayed. She was a fascinating contributor to a tragic and continuing case, the case of the Filipina who was trafficked with drugs on her and was slated to be executed with the Bali 9. She was reprieved at that time. She's still in jail, and Felicity is working on that, many other cases similar to those. She also is an academic, and her research deals with the fields of human trafficking, gender equality, evidence, and female genital mutilation. And I've not met her before, but after listening to her for 5 minutes, she says she's going to talk about all of this, and I have no doubt that she'll be capable of doing that.
Thank you. I don't know about all of it, but I'll pick two. The wicked problem, it seems to me, for history is the treatment of women. And that wicked problem finds itself in the topic this evening. I'm going to start with human trafficking and the story of Mary Jane Veloso, just for you to realise how wicked the problem is, and then move on to the topic of justice in the age of global dislocation, but perhaps calling it for the moment justice in the age of global movement. Starting with human trafficking, my work in London involved being a criminal barrister at the time, but I became interested in what happens if your client has committed a crime but they're under coercion or they've acted as a victim of human trafficking. And if you pause for a moment, we think about ISIS and we think about the treatment of women by ISIS and the slavery that women are placed in by ISIS. And we think of our own history as women. There are moments when you can think about not being terribly far apart. And if we are going to think that particular terrorist organisations are as frightening as they are, then we do have to think about how frightening we are. So I started to research what should a lawyer do if their client is a victim of human trafficking. And it was a particularly difficult problem, solved eventually by the Court of Appeal, who said it's all an abusive process, you mustn't prosecute these people at all. providing there's credible evidence that they are human trafficked victims. The reason the Court of Appeal could do that was because we had a Human Rights Act that insists on us referring to the European Convention on Human Rights. We now have some stupid debate in England about exiting the Europe and having our own Bill of Rights will no doubt be incredibly colonial and anti-women probably, but there we go. That's for a platform in England, I think. So the research that I did was, well, hang on a minute, Court of Appeal, very good. Abusive process, let's argue that for our client. We had a client, didn't work. And my client, as well as the research that I was doing, she went to prison for 7 years, and it was all terribly difficult. So I came to Australia. That's a whole long story. I'll tell you another time. And I started to work at Charles Darwin University as well as being a barrister. And as an academic, you really have to have a topic that you research. And I thought, well, what about human trafficking? What about women in the justice system? What about the visibility of women in the justice system? There's not many of me, Women Queen's Council. I'm not an alumni of somewhere particularly special, so I can't join the gentlemen in that. I was born in East London, and it was a bloody hard task to get to where I am now. And if it's difficult for me, how difficult is it for a woman like Mary Jane Veloso in abject poverty who has no other choice than to travel where she did? So I looked at the law on human trafficking in England, which by this time had brought about the Modern Slavery Act, which has a complete defence that you can raise if your client has committed a crime, certain crimes, and you can raise the defence of human trafficking, then they raise that complete defence. Hopefully they're not prosecuted at all. All of this comes from international obligations that have been implemented in Europe and then in England and Wales. I looked at the Indonesian law because in Darwin we're closer to Indonesia than we are to Melbourne. I looked at the Philippines law and various other places. The Indonesian law is really, really interesting. It has a specific law issued by the Office for the Empowerment of Women and Girls in Indonesia that says that victims of human trafficking who commit crime, victim has a particular definition, will be protected, will not be prosecuted. I'm paraphrasing slightly, but similar to the Modern Slavery Act. They've had it since 2007. England and Wales brought it in 2015. The Philippines had one in 2003, updated in 2012. These countries know they have a human trafficking problem. Australia does not have such a law. It has a policy about protecting human trafficked victims. Quite how they're going to find them, how you're going to find them, I don't quite know. So having done this research, I got an email that said, "Save Mary Jane, sign our petition." And I sat in my little room in Darwin and thought, well, I've got a separation of powers, that's political, I don't know if I'm going to sign a petition. I'm a lawyer, I get very hung up about petitions, so I might not sign it, what do I do? Plus I'll get a load of spam. So I didn't sign it, but I emailed, I said, I think I can help you. And those of you who've watched Correspondence, Foreign Correspondent know the rest, because I did help the Philippines lawyers. I'm not her lawyer, I'm someone who's helped the Philippine lawyers. And I was in Jakarta a week or so ago speaking at a forum in the University of Indonesia, and I also had an opportunity of speaking to a government minister over there. But the way that you effectively help your client is to use what are called human trafficking referral mechanisms. What that really means is you tell the authorities that your client is a victim, and the authorities are supposed to investigate that and discover whether there's credible evidence, and if there is, not to prosecute at all, or not to punish if it's sufficiently serious for there to be a prosecution, not to punish in the same way. Australia doesn't have those provisions. Of course, the human trafficking referral mechanism in Australia is filling in a form. You like forms. I'm not sure how many victims of human trafficking are actually going to be in a position to fill in a form, but there we go. So the consequence was that the Philippine lawyers used the human trafficking referral mechanisms, her recruiters were identified, they're currently on trial. It became perfectly plain that there was evidence that she was a victim of human trafficking when she took drugs across the border. And she was reprieved 30 minutes before she was due to be shot. She'd said goodbye to her children and her mum. I'd gone to bed, and ironically my daughter was with me, not knowing if my client would be there in the morning. And I've never had a client shot, so it was a really emotional experience. You have a connection of mums across the world. I've never met her. I daren't go and say, hello, I'm your lawyer, because it ratchets up the issue. I only provide whatever assistance I can provide. And she lived, but she's still in prison. The trial of her recruiters goes on. And you stop to think about the real issue, which is, across the world, we lock up women in prison, in detention, who are victims of abuse, violence, coercion, abuse of vulnerability, deceived, manipulated, all of the definitions within the human trafficking protocol, all of those real life issues that women suffer. My dream project is to go in every prison and interview the women who are in there. Most of them should not be in there. Certainly in detention, the women and children should not be in there. And the only reason they are in there is, as Julian says, that we have this terrible prejudice. One is sexism, the other is racism. I find here, I'm a little bit Indian, I find here I hang on to it, because you don't want to listen to English people anyway. You've been listening to them in the past, and who wants to listen to the English? Anyway, who wants to listen to a girl from Dagenham? You just want to tell me a funny joke about myself and the chip fork in the steering wheel, or whatever it is. So I hang on to the fact that I'm a little bit brown. And you can't help but think most of these problems, not just about women, but you start to think about how many brown women are we looking up that have come across the border with drugs up their bum. And I'm not sure how many of us would choose to put drugs up our bum. And if we're not choosing, then it's highly likely they're victims of human trafficking. So just think about those women travelling, moving, an age of global movement across borders, who are moving in situations of abuse, of vulnerability in particular. Those women who sit in detention centres, as Julian was speaking about, who sit in prison like Mary Jane Veloso. How much do you know about the women in prison in Australia, in a country where there is no law to protect human trafficking victims? There's laws to prosecute the traffickers, of course, but no mandatory protection for human traffic victims. Lots of shaming around women as well. If women do commit a crime, lots of shaming. Next time you pick up a newspaper, you look at the way a woman's case is reported differently from a man's. Which brings me to female genital mutilation, which is an area in which I hope I never get another brief, because if I do, it means a child has been cut. And most people don't know a lot about female genital mutilation, and I'm not going to bang on about it all evening. I have had one audience, I got them all to chant vagina, but I'll let you off tonight. I wrote a book called The Sexual Offences Handbook in 2010 with a colleague, because as a woman at the bar, first of all, you get given family law, and you don't want to do that because it's miserable, because there's an identifiable enemy, it's him or her. Then you get given the sexual offences, so I was determined to be the best at sexual offences and write the book on it. And we had a long debate about including a chapter on FGM, and eventually we did, because some forms of FGM are designed to take away a woman's sexual pleasure. And I contacted the English equivalent of the DPP and said, well, we've got sexual offences prevention orders, why don't we use them in the context of FGM? Oh, they said, oh no, they don't apply. I said, well, I think they could do, or at least you could propose an amendment. I'm sure the government would listen to you. No, don't apply. There was a long pause, we put it in the book. And then I was invited by the very same Crown Prosecution Service, would you come and train all our lawyers on FGM? So I forgave them, and I did. And there was a prosecution, but it failed, and there's been one in Sydney since. But that was in 2010. So for 6 years, I've been involved in campaigns in England and Australia to raise awareness in relation to FGM. Often what you get is the same reaction, oh, Muslims. We've recently added the figures for Indonesia. The estimated numbers of women and children at risk of female genital mutilation was running for about 10 years at about 140 million women and girls. Adding in Indonesia added in another 60 million, so we're now on estimated data of 200 million women and girls, different types and levels of female genital mutilation. The problem then is, when you're trying to deal with it as a women's health issue, because it has terrible health consequences, the reaction is extremely discriminatory. Oh, that's what they do. That's what those African people do. That's what those Muslim people do. But we really have to challenge ourselves about that because it's really important in the context of global movement. You Australians love to travel. I haven't met one yet that hasn't. I went from -5 to +35. I thought I was amazing. It was one journey. You've been everywhere. You like going everywhere. And what I don't understand is why you don't like everybody coming in. And what was really weird was you let my husband in really easily. It took me ages to get admitted as a lawyer, so that was really weird too. It's like you'll dish out a 457 visa to some bloke that can build a building, but you're a bit peculiar about some woman that can argue the law, but there we go, I got there in the end. The people that I've seen in the detention centre in Darwin had PhDs. They were a bit cleverer than me, and I didn't speak Farsi either, and they spoke English. So you start to think, hang on a minute, why am I here? They really let them in and I'll go, you know. So I started to look at how can we tackle female genital mutilation in a really non-discriminatory way. And you start to discover that 40 years ago there was some research around intercision with Indigenous people that seems to have been left behind because they've learned to educate their girls in extremely difficult circumstances and hopefully not to have sex until they're much older, so no need for intercision there. So we can learn a great deal from Aboriginal people despite all the appalling atrocities that they've suffered. And the priority that they give and the value that they give to their women. Secondly, we have a significant problem with young white girls having labiaplasty to make their vaginas look like the sort of vaginas their boyfriends see in pornography on the internet. So you start to think, well, hang on a minute, this isn't just what they do, it's a problem, a cultural problem that we need to deal with as a women's health issue. And I went for something called a well woman check. I got old enough to have one. I didn't go for ages because I didn't want to be old enough to have one. And they asked me loads of questions about my sex life and my husband's sex life. That was a bit weird. So they said, you know, do you take it up the bum? Do you take it in the mouth? Do you do all these things? You have to answer these questions. You have to think about a few of them. Has your husband had an affair? Have you? Really, actually, very important health questions. And at the end, I said, but you haven't asked me anything about FGM. Which my daughter afterwards said, oh, typical of you, Mum. And I said, yeah, it is typical of me because you have to raise awareness about it. And if you asked every mum, have you had FGM, have you got a daughter, would you cut your daughter, as a tick box on a health visitor form or a well woman check, what's harm in that? You're not discriminating against anybody. Think of all the cultural things we could have discovered if we treated, for example, underage sex, or for example, underage sex with priests that we could have dealt with. Sorry, for those of you religious in the room, I'm not even going to go there again, but you can start to think of our own cultural history in relation to women in a very different way. The first prosecution for marital servitude in England was this year, because they created an offence of servitude. And then, oh my goodness, somebody argued, how can you possibly apply that to marriage? So, well, you have been for centuries, but there's only one conviction. Otherwise, everybody's getting away with it. That's just what they do. You can see how there's so many nonsenses about discrimination and the sorts of issues that we have to tackle. So that's my 5-minute warning. I can speak for England, but I'm just going to go back to Julian's analogy. And I love what Julian said, but I just want to pick you up on one thing. Well, I'm going to tell it in two ways. The first is it reminded me immediately of Richard Pryor. That I don't know if any of you remember the comedian Richard Pryor. When he hears a smash in the living room, goes in the living room, so who broke that? Huh? Who broke that? I'm going to tell you, okay? And that look from the child who's not going to tell you at all what happened reminded me of Richard Pryor. Those of you who like it, you'll find it on the internet. He delivers it far better than I. But the other part is that actually real justice is mum goes in there, sweeps up the vase and doesn't punish anybody because she's never going to know who did it. And what's the point of sending him to bed without any supper? Because he's going to cry anyway. And you can say, well, never mind, dear, don't break mummy's vase again. It's only a thing. So I get why you gave the example. I really do. But in relation to women in prison and children in detention and children in prison, the massive problems with youth justice here and locking up children, criminalising whole generations of children, the answer is just don't punish them for breaking the vase. Don't punish them for taking drugs across the border. Don't prosecute in the first place. We have to change. And the way we have to change is to stop locking people up. It's really, really simple. It doesn't do any good. At most, it keeps people off the streets who are largely victims of abuse. So really, they could do with being assisted to have proper health treatment. And then how long do you keep them off the streets for before they're utterly hopeless? It really is utterly pointless. Of course, there are some people who are dangerous and have issues, but something like 2 to 9% of prisoners are women. It's exceptional to have a woman in court anyway. Most men in prison have probably got a traumatic brain injury from pissing it up the wall and beating each other up for years. So they're probably ill with mental health problems. Most women in prison have got multiple issues. Most children in prison simply have been punished with no supper for breaking a vase. Sorry, I can't resist it. But I think the culture that needs to change, and I like coming to Victoria because you at least do have some form of human rights charter. I struggle in Darwin. There aren't any human rights in Darwin. There is one, actually. I found it. It's section 138(3) of an evidence provision that relies on the International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. So I thought it was amazing. I found one human right in the Northern Territory. So I like coming here. If you've got human rights, just use them. Use them. It's got to be a balanced and proportionate response. Human rights is all about actually everybody moving a little bit into the middle. It might make us all a little bit boring. It may even make us a little bit browner over time, like me, because I had a racy great-grandmother, but that's another story. But that's what human rights to me really mean. If we're all going to be equal in some way and have equality, whatever adjustments we need for that to be properly achieved, then that's what we need to do, is change. We have to change. We have to demonstrate it's better to live in Australia than it is to go and live in Syria with ISIS. For women not to choose to go and live with ISIS because it has a perception of being better than living in England. That's a problem that England has, and no doubt Australia has and will have. I'll leave you with this, and it's slightly off topic, but it's the one I like to say the most because I think it's quite challenging. If a 15-year-old child is groomed on the internet for sex, we call them a victim. If a 15-year-old child is groomed on the internet for terrorism, we call them a defendant. It's really, really weird. So I think I'll leave you with, it's us that has to change. In order to achieve justice, we have to treat dislocation as movement and let everybody move. For me, I did it. I'm still here. I feel like saying I'm still here, you bastards, like Papillon, because that always reminds me of Nauru. But thank you for listening. Lots for you to talk about. I think the message really is, if you just think how bad our history has been, particularly towards women and children, it doesn't mean these phenomena are new. There have been crises in history for generations. We chopped off heads of states. Whole families have died. We've had revolutions and conflict for centuries. Maybe the answer is to have more women in conflict resolution on the international stage, but that's perhaps another speech. So that's me. I think I've run over time like everyone else. That seems to be what I'm supposed to do. At least there's a proportion of Victoria that's going to leave this room and alter. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Felicity, and thank all three. We have time now for questions and answers. Just before that, Julian's analogy, I came at it from another angle. There's a lot of research by social psychologists, particularly a guy called Tom Tyler from NYU in New York, on why people obey the law. And the work has been done all over the world, and the answers seem to be very clear. You imagine that if somebody is taken to court The real issue for them is whether they win or lose. But what this research shows again and again in many, many different countries is what, of course they want to win, but what matters as well and centrally to their faith in the system and to the legitimacy of the authorities that deal with them is that they feel they have been treated fairly. And I think that when we talk about refugees, there are huge geopolitical issues of the sort that Paris raised, but there is another domain of issues which I think we have to think about very much, and that is, quite apart from what you think about the world problems, have we lived up in the way that we treat refugees to the principles that we domestically claim, and I think with some good reason, to uphold? Principles of fairness, principles of allowing people to appeal against judgments, to provide evidence, to be treated like people with a voice. I guess a chair shouldn't be making any interventions. All right, now, questions and answers.
Are temporary protection visas legally normalised now? Are they now part of the kind of normal state of discussion?
On the question around temporary protection visas, they are now part of Australian legislation and law, but only applied to people who arrive by boat. So that sort of contradiction that Julian applied to, that is another feature of what I personally believe is an injustice for two reasons. Well, probably more than two, but first of all, temporary protection visas don't stop anyone from fleeing. They never have, they never will. They are only being applied as an additional punitive measure towards a particular cohort of people. And I just think we should get rid of them because they get in the way of people's ability to settle, they fester resentment and distress. We will have people here that will never see their children unless they choose to go back to a situation that they fled for 10, 15 years. And it's not acceptable.
Julian, do you want to?
I agree, but I would add there's another reason that temporary protection visas are bad, and that is that it is typically, boat people typically have come from cultures which are very different from ours, and if you give them temporary protection so that in 3 years' time they've got to prove again that they're still, they still have a well-founded fear of persecution back in their home country, it means that they have to mark time. And you've got to decide, as a country, are we better off if those people feel part of our community or they're just marking time until things get better over there? Yeah, it's just not good. I mean, imagine yourself in the other position. You've gone over to live in, say, Iran, and you're learning Farsi, but you're really not sure if you're going to be staying. So how embedded do you become? As for your other thing, I think it is profoundly wrong that the minister should be able to cancel a person's citizenship without a proper hearing. And at least one reason for that is this. If your citizenship is cancelled, your passport is cancelled, and while you may be a dual citizen, you may not have two passports. And if you are suddenly left with citizenship somewhere and no passport, you can't travel, and you become practically stateless. But apart from that, ministers, especially ministers with the sort of track record that Peter Dutton has, should never be allowed to make a decision that affects someone else's life.
I'm going to be an annoying person that just adds a comment, only because someone brought up TPVs. I'm a lawyer for a caseload of people who arrived in Australia by boat.
Can you speak more closely to the microphone? I'm having trouble hearing.
So I'm a lawyer who represents people who arrive by boat in Australia. Myself and my colleagues spend an incredible amount of time on the phone talking through these issues of re-traumatised people about the idea that they will never have a sense of security in their lives again, even once they're found to be refugees, and importantly will never be able to be reunited with their families. Why I'm going to be annoying and just make a comment is because it's not till I started practicing in this area that I realised incredibly how unjust that is to women. People who typically get on boats to come to Australia are men leaving women and children behind in incredibly dangerous situations. When the man is found to be a refugee, it's generally in situations that would also, if the woman had hopped on the boat with their children, would have also let the woman be found to be a refugee. So the policy of temporary protection is also now is an accepted policy, I think, of the Australian government that leaves women and children in situations of great harm, as well as obviously then denying them a right to a life in a family unit for the indefinite future that they are going to want to be in Australia for the reason of safety.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I
Who would like, please?
First of all, thank you, and I want to congratulate you for making that point, because it's absolutely real. But here's the absurdity of it. At some point, we will make them permanent residents. But it's going to mean they will be separated from their families for years and years and years before we do that. When they are reunited, they won't know their kids and their kids won't know them. The strain on those relationships is enormous. And so what we're really doing is placing people, leaving women and children in the situation you're talking about now, but also crushing their futures in many respects in a way that's utterly unnecessary and that we're going to change down the track anyway. So let's just get on with it now so people can get back together and get on with their lives.
Would anyone else on the panel like to speak to that?
I would like to add to that. I agree with Paris. It's marvellous that you're doing what you do. I also agree that the TPVs are one example of the awful heartlessness of the system we run. Just one example, but it shows a heartless system. And what we need to do is, taking all of the heartlessness and cruelty and brutality of our system, put it all together and say, is this really the country we are? You know, we're told by the politicians they're protecting our borders. What are they doing to our character? I would much rather we protect our character than try and fend off a tiny fragment of humanity from our borders. We don't need to be protected from them. We need to be protected from our politicians.
I think I should add that clearly you're talking on the topic that is extremely close to my heart, and 20 minutes isn't long enough to deal with feminist legal history or legal theory, women and justice, ISIS and slavery. So huge topics. But if you just think about those words for a moment and think about those women, it's just unbelievable that we are allowing that to happen. And the sort of silly story, I always tell a bit of a silly story about things because it's the sort of stuff that sticks in your head. And you'll go away and you'll think, oh, we had this woman who talked about, you only remember about 10% of what we say anyway, because we're lawyers and we talk all the time. But if you were in that situation and you were married as I am, I have to say, I would expect my husband to get on a boat and get me out of there. That seems to me is basic survival.
No. I understand that, but no, I disagree with you. A lot of men make the journey alone in order to protect their wife and children from... They blaze a trail.
I agree with that, and I hadn't quite finished. I would expect my husband to do that. People do it for different reasons, was what I was about to say, and there are there's a lot to unpack in that comment, and you're quite right to pull me up because you thought that I was going to leave it at that point. My expectation is the way I think about my morality and my ethical core. And I think that's where Julian and I do agree, that it's not just about your character, it's about the ethical core of the people that you are. And the way that we treat women and girls at the moment in this world has no ethical core. And particularly in the context of refugees and human trafficking victims, it is just wrong.
Can I add one thing to that? We think that we are more or less a society that is adjusted to the idea that women and men are equal. We think that. And you may remember that when the first Abbott cabinet had just one woman in it, Julie Bishop, there was a certain degree of discomfort in the community, thinking, why only one woman? But then imagine what the response might have been if the first Julia Gillard cabinet had had only one man in it. Would have been a radically different reaction. We have not yet found equality for women, even though we think we have.
Yeah.
My question's for Paris. Paris, we have met on a number of occasions. My name's Chris Cummins. I was working on Christmas Island for 5 years as a torture and trauma counsellor.
Yeah.
I've got two questions for you, Paris, and I hope you don't find offence. The first one is, I'm wondering whether or not you actually have any personal regret in accepting the appointment to go on to the expert panel. And secondly, I'm wondering, with the benefit of hindsight or with time, whether you would still make those same 22 recommendations that were released in the report in the attempt that they were made.
Thanks, Christine. It's good to see you again. Thanks for the questions. I do often think about whether or not I regretted accepting that invitation to join the panel. It does feel like it was the gift that keeps on giving in many respects. Look, at the end of the day, I just felt as though we could do much better than what we were doing. That yes, this was a difficult issue to contend with, but we had become fantastic at pointing out what we don't like. We'd become well-versed at identifying who we don't like and why we don't like them. And we'd been terrible at coming up with viable alternatives that could package up something far better for us as a nation, far better for hundreds of thousands, probably millions of people in our region, that could model something that other parts of the world could do, that would mean refugees and people fleeing persecution could find sanctuary inside of a system that would take care of them and then provide them with decent outcomes which they all deserved. That was the compelling reason for me. Now, it's a bit starry-eyed, it's a bit probably naive and so forth, but I just felt that there was potential at that point in time. I had made mistakes. I had made assumptions that other people had got to that same point. But the politics of it really was not like that. And we have become very, very invested in the fight and the contest. And somewhere in the middle of that fight and the contest are the people we all care about and are worried about. But most of the attention is who's going to win the next round. And I just felt as though then, and I feel even more so now, that's not getting us to a point of dealing with these sorts of issues, whether it's around the women who are left stranded in very dangerous situations or are making choices to get on boats and so forth here or in the Mediterranean. So I just felt, should I have a crack at it? And yes, I did. Did I think there would be consequences and risks? I was sure of it. Do I have any space left in my back for knives? No, I don't. And they come from all sorts of different places, including people who were friends at times. So I think about it a lot. If I had my time over again, I would probably accept it, because I think we have to keep trying. On the other point about would I make different recommendations, I would certainly present them differently. The first thing I would do is say it's not going to be done in 6 weeks. So we had 6 weeks to put that together. I think I would change the way in which some of the recommendations were made. I would add other things to it that weren't there in that package at the time, But the package was meant to be a template, that if we could get people to come together, we could just keep building on. People think, for example, a regional system. Everybody agrees, let's have a regional system. Everyone. That's the one thing everyone agrees on. No one says how. No one says what would you do if people go around that regional system and undermine its credibility and its effectiveness. They're the difficult points that we need to keep working on. But the underlying principle shouldn't be one of punishment and punitive action, because it's not necessary. I know we're presented with the view that that's necessary. I know it's projected in the context that these are people we might need to be worried about and scared of. But all of that is bullshit. At the end of the day, even for the people who aren't refugees but are fleeing poverty or countries that are riddled with sanctions or whatever the case may be, they're not doing anything evil to us. There is no reason to treat people harshly or unfairly. And I don't think what's currently happening is sustainable, precisely because that's what we are doing. And therefore, things will collapse. Nauru and Manus Island were never intended, never believed would stop boats. And they haven't. It's a mythology that keeps getting perpetuated. So I would change some of the recommendations. I would certainly change the way they were contextualised. I would change how they were presented. Do I think it would be successful second time round? At the moment, probably not, but I'd keep having a go.
Can I add a footnote to that? As I watched Paris in his epic struggle with the politicians over the panel's report, I was reminded of the adage that you never wrestle with a pig because you both get covered in shit and the pig loves it.
Well, we're just about to raise the tone, please.
In terms of refugee policy, I know at the moment we've heard about the high levels of refugee numbers in the world, the highest since the World War II. We've also, experts are saying that numbers of refugees are going to be on the increase due to climate change. In terms of climate change, we often see policy looking at both the budget of greenhouse gas emissions and the time frame that we have to deal with those greenhouse gas emissions. And I was wondering, like in refugee argument, we very rarely hear about, say, a budget of refugees that need to be settled and the time frame that we think is acceptable to settle that entire number of refugees. The number of refugees from World War II, I went to a lecture at Melbourne University about that last year, and they weren't resettled until 1968, the International Year of the Refugee. We spoke, Castlemaine Rural Australians for Refugees spoke to Bendigo's Lisa Chesters last year. She's our local Labor MP. And she said that she hoped that a UN summit, she actually said that she hoped Bill Shorten would ask for a UN summit to be held in Australia to talk about the global crisis in refugees and conflict. The Secretary-General of the UN, as it happens, has actually called that summit already, and it will be held next week. It's the World Humanitarian Summit. There's been very little press about it. Castlemaine RAR has contacted both Malcolm Turnbull's office and Bill Shorten's office asking who'll attend the summit, and we haven't been able to find out who from Australia will attend. But if there was a global, as a global summit, what would you hope would be an outcome globally a global summit would have as a refugee policy, and what should Australia's contribution to the Worldwide Humanitarian Summit next week be?
That's a nice question with which to round up. It's also a good time to make it that. Because it takes us back to our general introductory topic. So if you could think, all of you, any of you, have answers, this will be the end, and then Peter will say some remarks about tomorrow. Please, but it's a nice way to segue.
I would, I'm just cherry picking out of your comment. it seems to me it's understandable but incorrect to refer to climate refugees, because the definition of refugee in the Convention and in our law is someone who's unwilling or unable to return to their country of origin because of a well-founded fear of persecution. Now, the fact that their country of origin has disappeared beneath the ocean does not make them a refugee. It's crazy. I happen to think global warming is the first-order issue facing the world today. Refugees are a second-order issue facing the world today. I would like to see the definition of refugee expanded so as to include climate refugees. I don't think it's going to happen. But we can make a contribution by taking global warming seriously and getting on with it and doing something real to combat something which all the science tells us is real and dangerous and about to hit us harder than we've ever imagined possible. By the way, for those of you who have the misfortune to bump into climate change denialists, they will say, oh yeah, but hang on, we don't decide science by majority vote, and that is true. But let's give it odds. Let's say there's an 80% chance that the world scientists are wrong and that climate change isn't real, isn't anthropogenic, isn't serious. Only a 20% chance that it'll come home to roost. Well, 20% chance of a catastrophic outcome that's avoidable is worse odds than Russian roulette. So who do you know who will play Russian roulette with their children and grandchildren? Get them to answer that, and you'll see where the argument develops. But I agree with you, it is a really, really major problem we've got to do something about, but refugee policy is not going to do it.
Well, again, I'll pick up on just bits of what you said. I think, around 21 years ago, there was a reasonably seminal paper on women in international law and how you look at women in that perspective, both the women working in it and the women who are victims of international atrocities. And the real issue was visibility of women. So an international humanitarian conference next week, I think that's the issue. We either see women, for centuries we didn't see women at all. They weren't believed, or they were property, similarly with children. Now we see them generally as victims. There's a few actors in the system, like me, but not very many. So I think that the visibility of women and how to achieve the visibility of women is the next frontier. That if women are going to achieve justice and procedural fairness, don't get me started on how procedures don't help women. How are we going to see women visibly at every sector of society, at every level? Not just as victims, which at the moment seems to be the paramount ideology. It's a nebulous answer to your question, but if you just stop for a moment and look at where women are, the answer to those questions, I think, are as important as climate change.
Yes.
I'll just respond to the bit about the conference that's coming up, the international conference, and what I think it might mean for refugees. But before I do that, I didn't mention something in Christine's comment. What's happening at the moment in response to the panel's recommendations is nothing what the panel recommended. What I spoke to you about tonight was what was recommended. What is happening now is an abomination, basically. The thing that worries me is our inability to examine all of the facts fairly, even the ones that leave us feeling uncomfortable. Because until we look at all of the facts, it becomes very difficult for us. And the numbers are important in that sense, and I think they will affect the outcomes of this meeting you're talking to. Julian, who I have enormous admiration for and gratitude towards for everything he advocates and the way he does it. The problem that policymakers and governments know around the world, and I think, Julian, you referred to, let's accept that it would be 25,000 a year. They know it won't stay at 25,000 a year because they know the numbers are in fact much bigger than that. And because of that, my greatest fear is in that meeting, they will look to find ways to restrict movement and block people from being able to obtain the protection they need by fortressing their own frontiers. And if that occurs, then I think we are in for a whole world of pain internationally, mostly refugees and asylum seekers. So the risk of that meeting is that in coming together with all of the good intent, the real action of governments will be to find, particularly developed countries, will be finding ways to fortress themselves from the developing world and people fleeing those conflicts. That's the real risk. The convention is a very good convention. I wouldn't incorporate people displaced by climate into the refugee convention. I think it warrants and deserves its own convention for dealing with that issue itself and should get one. We should have one like that. But our inability to actually confront real issues, from government's point of view, it's the suffering that people are enduring. They conveniently find ways to avoid dealing with the realities of that. For the people in my position, we avoid like the plague, a discussion about what the scale of the numbers really mean. How many people dying is too many? What number per annum is manageable and okay when the numbers are insurmountable? It won't be fixed in that sort of a debate. It'll be fixed by looking at systems and mechanisms for managing this problem better. Coming back to Martin's introductory comments about a wicked problem. The worst thing about wicked problems is that you're often grappling with what is the least harmful way of managing the issue. And that's an awfully difficult thing for people to confront and deal with. So I hope that meeting presents us with real viable alternatives. I think there'll be a lot of talk about real viable alternatives and a lot of talk about doing more. I'm not as confident that the action will live up to that talk.
Can I add one thing that comes from something you taught me, Martin, at Cranlana?
It's got to be good. You've got all the night. Don't stop.
In Thucydides' history of the Peloponnesian Wars, he speaks about the commission from the Athenians who went to see the commissioners of the island of Melos. Melos was strategically located near Sparta, and the Athenians wanted it as a jumping off point for attacking Sparta. So they went to speak to them and they said, look, we know you've done nothing wrong to us, but we're going to take you over. And there's an easy way and there's a hard way, and the easy way is just let us in, and the hard way is we're going to kill the men and boys and rape the women and children. And we know you'll say this is unjust. But you know as well as we do that justice is only relevant between equals in power. And when power is not equal, the strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. And that really struck me when you taught us that passage. And I think that's exactly what you see at the international level when it comes to dealing with problems like refugees, like climate change. The strong do what they will and the weak suffer what they must. If we have any instinct for justice at all, we have to resist that sort of justice, because it's not justice at all as the way we understand it.
But, they killed them all anyway. They killed the millions. They killed all the millions anyway. They mediated and still killed them.
Yeah. No, they resisted.
Yes, but then they killed them anyway.
Because that was what they promised.
It's very often we get caught up with discussions about justice because it's so hard to say what is just. It's much easier to say what's unjust, and people find it much easier to identify blatant injustices than they do to spin a theory about what justice really is about. What unites, I think, all the panellists from their various different positions is that they have identified some patent and blatant injustices, but because we're talking about wicked problems, truly wicked problems, both in the sense that I mentioned, they're technically difficult and they're morally fraught, it's much harder to do what Paris has, I think, very bravely put his neck out to do by getting onto that commission, and Bendigo has a day and a half to solve all of these problems. And so I hope tomorrow you're here and we can hammer out the other part, the harder part. Thank you very much. And before you move, please show again your appreciation for